Thank you so much for that very kind and warm welcome. I think we would all agree, having looked at this show, that there is a remarkable degree of resonance, of connection between these two bodies of work. There's I think a similar kind of thinking and attitude to the process, to thinking about location and landscape and place. So I've got a few things that I'd like to talk about. I'm going to also leave some time for you to ask questions, because I'm sure you've probably got a few that you can put to the artists. But I think one of the good places to start when you talk about a show like this, and that represents a pretty broad basic body of work, is to get just a simple sense of where this work came from and what some of the ideas were that led into its creation and, I guess, selection for this show. So, Tamara, perhaps we could start with you. If you could just talk a little bit about the work that's in the show, what it represents in terms of when you were making it, the sorts of ideas that you were thinking of when you were doing it.
Sure. So the works that Bridget has selected for inclusion in the show span probably about a decade of my practice, some of my earliest works to some of my more recent works. I guess across that entire time, my works have always dealt with the idea or the themes of humans and the way we relate to nature. And over the course of that time, the way that I've approached the shoots has changed. In the beginning, I took people into a landscape and sort of had them performing in a way, and now I've sort of evolved that thematically, taken away the narrative a little bit from being within the shot itself and made it more the narrative, a broader narrative about humanity being a part of nature, and I'm just really trying to refine that idea in the way that I'm presenting my work. Did that answer your question?
Yes, it did. But so just in terms of the works that as they're sequenced through the show, are they representative of one sequence of works, or is this representative of work over time?
Work over time, yeah. So they sit quite comfortably together, but I've moved through a variety of different. I work in series, and so there's perhaps 6 different bodies of work represented by some of the works.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Nicole, can you talk a little bit about the work you've got here?
Yes, I can. So Bridget has curated into this show what I call my trilogy of works, which were the first 3 main series that I made where I was doing interventions in the landscape. And that's Illumination, which is the chandelier, and Apparitions, which was working with a media projector in the landscape and projecting historical paintings onto the actual landscape at different locations around Australia. And then Eastern Interiors, which is the mirrored work, where I travelled with that mirror from the edge of the Blue Mountains and followed the pathways of the first explorers through what they called at that time the Eastern Interior of Australia, which was a completely unknown, down to Albury on the Victorian border, and placed that mirror at locations that different explorers had written about in their journals. And so there was a kind of evolution from the first series with the chandelier through to this series. So that's 2015, and then the video work Transformation was made in 2018, which is my latest instalment of an ongoing series called My Body Works, where I use my figure in the landscape to explore the idea of our connection to environment and the internal kind of landscape being reflected in the external, and that symbiotic relationship between the health of our ecology and the health of the environment that we coexist in.
What do you feel that when you look at Tamara's work, what resonates with you in the sense that it connects to what you do?
I was just telling Tamara that a friend of ours, Huey Selwood, was in your works, back in 2010.
Yeah, 5. That's when I was shooting them,
Yeah, so I saw those works when I was doing a residency at Hill End, and you know, I instantly recognised a similar, you know, exploration of creating narrative in landscape and kind of interrupting, and to look at Tamara's work, the decade-long exploration that she's achieved, I really admire the progression and the evolution that's, you know, started with those early works at the back to these huge works here. There's a beautiful evolution in technique and also exploration, including more figures and merging more into the environment. Yeah. So I enjoy them. Absolutely.
And what of Nicole's work for you, Tamara? What do you connect with in her work?
Well, I have only recently been introduced to Nicole's work through this exhibition, which has been a beautiful way to come into it because our work sits so comfortably together. But I mean, I love the use of symbolism and the way that Nicole's really refined what she says in these works without having to kind of overburden them with much interference. I love the aesthetic qualities, and I love the way she references history and colonialism and the things that that I find interesting.
I see a connection in the work that you both make in the way that you engage with the landscape as a place that can stage a moment for the camera, a kind of theatrical staging, if you like, either with the mirrors and projections and so on, or say in your work with the figures and actions and so forth. So I thought maybe we should now step into sort of teasing out the differences. So Nicole, could you talk a little bit about how you conceive of a site for a series of works or for a single work, and how you sort of go through the idea of producing, say, with the mirror pieces, I'm going to do this here?
Good question. So I think I have to go back to the illumination series. I did this residency at Hill End, which is, are you familiar with Hill End? It's a gold mining town. It's about an hour, 15 minutes from where I live and where I grew up. But it's quite a harsh landscape. And when I went to do the residency, what really struck me was the amount of ornate antique furniture that was still there in the houses. And my mum was an antique stealer in the 70s, and she tells stories about being able to go out to Hill End and basically buy an entire house of antiques from the late 1800s that had just been abandoned when the gold ran out. It was too expensive to get furniture back across the mountains, so people just left. And so she said it was like a gold mine of furniture. But what struck me were the chandeliers in the houses, and just the effort that they must have gone to in the 1890s to get chandeliers across the mountains, to have this sense of home, to have this sense of Europe or England or wherever it was that they'd come from. And so from that I imagined the idea of taking that thought and making it into a work by placing the lit chandelier into the landscapes around that region. So the illumination series is in and around Safala, Hill End and Bathurst.
Do you remember though the moment when you kind of, that idea crystallised for you, that you would do this, that you would take the chandelier and find this location?
I do, yeah, I do. I get really vivid visuals about my work before I make it, and I saw in I think it's called Craigo Cottage, which is this beautiful cottage in Hill End that a very wealthy miner built to resemble a hunting lodge from Scotland, and it's just sitting in the middle of this really harsh foreign landscape, and it's still there, and 3 women lived in it up until I think the 1960s.
It's a mansion from memory. isn't it?
Yeah,
It's a very big building.
It's a big building and it's full of all of the antiques that the women had. And they just left it with all of the, and now it's a kind of museum and the chandeliers are there. And I just remember going through that and then contemplating and just seeing a chandelier in the landscape. And so then I thought, how am I going to do it? But then my father is has pedal beating businesses, so tow trucks and cranes, problem solved.
So Tamara, for you, just the location, what comes first? Is it the location or the idea, or is it sort of the two things together?
Location helps. Funnily enough, I started my first series, Ritualism, on a residency in Hill End as well. So there's a nice little connection there. Often for me to make, when I started making series of work, I had my children, I just had my kids, and so for me to be able to get the time to make a body of work, I needed to step outside of the domestic life and set aside time to do it. And so the location really did, certainly in the beginning, inform where I went, because where I went with the series, because I'd sort of place myself somewhere and then make a work. I mean, I guess they're quite slight responsive work, certainly in Our Nature is, and that was a different situation. But when I would go to a residency, that would be where I would start, and then I'd find the people that I needed to make the work. So in the beginning it was my friends, they would either be there or I'd make friends in the area, and that they were my characters. But then as my practice has evolved, I've kind of had to switch it around in some cases, where I find the people and then I find the location. This sort of is the middle ground in that way, but yeah, the location often does inform how it starts. Yeah.
So you both go out and these ideas crystallise, you make them happen in different ways. I wanted to talk to you both about editing, and by editing I mean selection of images for a series. What's the kind of ratio of shots to finished pieces, and how do you kind of go about thinking, okay, this is it, this is the complete sequence of works?
So editing is it's a challenge. I guess in a series there'd be thousands and thousands of images that I would have sifted through to get the final choices. Often when I do that editing process, it's a process of refinement, so I'll kind of edit down in blocks, and then ultimately I tend to choose the one that I have the most intuitive response to. So it's sort of, it's a very small amount of photographs that end up on the wall compared to the process that it took to get to that place. And often I'm working in a process that leads to an exhibition, and so there's a certain amount of works that I feel kind of work in a space, and but sometimes it's not quite as simple as that. Some my Endangered series there were 2 exhibitions, and it kind of had a process that went in a different way to other series that I've done.
Do you work in a similar way, Nicole?
Similar. I mean, what I love about photography is the room to fail. So I will often revisit a site, and because it's experimental, I'm going to project a painting onto the landscape. I have no idea how that's going to work or what it's going to look like. Often I'll do it 2 to 3 times to work out the tech, and fail, and drive myself crazy, going back to locations and experimenting. But I love that about photography, because you can take thousands of photos and you can leave room to experiment, and again, very tight selection around what ends up on the wall. But then, because of space and needing to have cohesion in a body of work, there's still images, you know, in the catalogue, in the backlog that I'm fond of. You know, if they don't make the final cut, doesn't mean that they haven't got something. And yeah, I just love photography for that process.
Do those images feel a bit orphaned from their series for you? I mean, you've still got love for them, but they're out of the sequence.
Yeah, there's something like that. Abandoned children. And then, I don't know about you, but I go back and I look at them and I think, wow, you know, why didn't I include that? Because sometimes they have something, you know, unique to offer. And so I do think about sometimes going back and reworking older series and pulling out images. There's not a lot of time.
Do you work at the same ratio as Tamara in terms of the number of shots that you would take until you found one that you felt like was the final image of that particular one?
I think for me, because for instance, if I'm going and setting up a projection, I'll set it up at 3 p.m. and then shoot maybe from 4 right through till 9 p.m. So that's a lot of images. And because light and changing light and the way it impacts on the installation is really important. And also the weather. So I just, I shoot for several hours and end up with thousands.
I think something, in terms of my process, sorry to jump in, but in terms of my process, all of those photographs that I'm taking, I don't expect to walk in and get the photograph that I'm going to exhibit at the beginning of a shoot. That entire shoot, which often for me is a couple of hours also, I see a lot of taking the photographs, the process of actually warming the people up in the landscape. You know, it's they're not necessarily all being taken to be the final image. They're working towards a moment where everything kind of comes together. And so even though I've taken lots, I'm not necessarily thinking that every one of those could be the image. It's a process of bringing the things together to a point.
And do you know that moment?
I know when it's past.
Yeah.
Which is a weird yeah, so yeah, it's a very like, there's a transition, and then I know that I hope that I've achieved it, but I know when it's over as well. And often that's the light has disappeared too.
So let's talk a little bit about the people in your pictures. Who are they, and what kind of things do you get them to do to go through that warm-up?
These days, I tend to put call-outs for my models on social media or through channels that I'm able to access. So they're often just everyday people, could be anyone in this room. There probably is some people in this room. What I do is nowadays I send them visual references to what I'm sort of trying to look for in a shoot, and so that there's some frame of reference that they're entering the process with. So for instance, with this image here, I was trying to create an image where I had people underwater that were sort of looking like a tornado of fish, those images you see of it. So I'd sort of send photographs of that, or painterly references, not saying this is what I'm wanting to create, but just trying to give a vague idea. So that gives a framework for how they approach it and see themselves in relationship to the environment. And so with this one also, there was a lot of direction in terms of, I didn't want necessarily a frontal position. I wanted it to be photographing their side flank, so that I had more of a sense of them relating to the fish shape, and finding the balance of nudity where I find it sits where the nudity isn't calling attention to itself, which sounds weird, but here they're sort of, I don't find that overwhelms the image. It's finding the balance where the image itself holds a narrative or a space that doesn't push it into a sexually charged image. It's just nude figures in a landscape.
You mentioned narrative, and that was something that I spoke with you both earlier about wanting to talk about, because I find it fascinating that when you present a series of images in sequence, it does tend to suggest even a very abstract story, one perhaps that's quite loose or a little ambiguous in terms of the actions within the frames, but together they create this sense of completeness and wholeness, like a series. So could you perhaps, Nicole, talk a little bit about how you think about that series and how you sequence them when you're having an exhibition?
Yeah, narrative, I think, for me is important in the works because I'm engaging history, landscape, and the history of the landscape, and trying to kind of make sense of that loaded, what in Australia it's a really loaded and recent history, 200 years of colonisation. So there's that narrative, and then there's the narrative of placing an object within the landscape to kind of draw that out or speak to that. So for me, it's operating on two levels. I'm thinking about that, the research, the place, the history, and then I'm just trying to work it out. You know, how this is going to fit into the landscape and reflect something along the lines of what I've come to understand about that place. And between my works, between the series of works that I make, which is why I work in sets of 3, I call them trilogies, there's a narrative. So the Illumination series has a narrative that continues into the apparitions and then into the Eastern interiors. And then it kind of feels like Star Wars when you do a trilogy, it's resolved.
So how do you think about the sequencing of the works for a series? I mean, narrative is a very loaded term and quite loose in the sense that it suggests kind of determination of how things will progress. But through that editing process you mentioned before, there's clearly a process of thinking, well, this is the way in which they can be viewed.
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about how you go through that process?
Well, it's hard to speak broadly because I'm finding that the different series that are represented here have different ways of doing that.
Well, just perhaps some of the works over here as a starting point.
So with the In Our Nature series, I created this body of work as a site-responsive work in the Adelaide Botanic Gardens for the biennial, the 2018 Adelaide Biennial of Australian Art. And so I guess I went into that wanting to create a broad narrative of relating the human figure to natural forms and creating a relationship between that tries to fuse those together to make the point that we are part of nature. And I chose to represent that across the seasons. So kind of using the different ages and stages of the human life cycle and the life cycle of a plant. So I went and revisited the gardens through each season. I'd arrive, because there were so many changes in the gardens over that period, I'd have to arrange all of the models that I was going to bring in based around age groups. So I had like kids, I had young people, I had an 80 plus group of people, well, actually it was 2 people, but 2 excellent people. And so in that one I chose the models first because I had to define it with something. I'd arrive and I would just walk those gardens like I've never walked anywhere before, just observing every single little thing, trying to find relationships that have been also, that are able to represent the season and the human element. So yeah, the narrative in those is a broader narrative, and then I would try and find ways that I found kind of elegantly told that story. In summer, I wanted an image that, this is a photograph I took in the same pond as the one on the left, so it's a sacred lotus pond in a different part of its life cycle. And that was, in fact, this was the first pond that, the first location I saw that inspired the whole series. And I was walking through the gardens with Martin Brown, my gallerist, who's here, and we came across this pond, and it was just one of the most phenomenal things I've seen, and so that kind of gave birth to the whole idea of the series. And for that pond, because of the flowers and the life and the feeling that I got from that pond in summer, I wanted to create an image that was like kind of stood a little bit out of my usual tonal range and had a summer-like feeling. So it was like youth and summer and kind of trying to represent it in that way. So there's like little narratives within a bigger narrative.
And that seasonal change gave you a bigger structure.
That's right. Yeah. And I loved the contrast between those two images and the way that the foliage has changed is, I love the way that those work together. And I had a spring, there's this image of that pond in spring as well, and winter. Winter didn't make it onto the wall.
One of the other things that I raised before we started today, and that maybe caused you both some concern, was a question about, I guess, what I call like an ethical consideration about intervention. And by that I meant a lot of photographers and artists have a kind of philosophy of non-intervention, complete non-intervention beyond just taking a photograph or recording a situation or landscape. And both of your bodies of work are marked by intervention into the place, either through the performers or with your sculptural mirrors and projections and so on. So I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about your thinking about that. I mean, I guess one aspect of that is sort of an impact in the landscape and what that kind of intervention actually means within the work. Nicole?
I think it's a good question, and it is something that is with me when I go into the landscape and create interventions, because I'm talking about colonisation and the force of that process and how it's affected over the past 200 years in the region that I live. It's been just over 200 years. The environment, Indigenous culture, and that history has been played out on that landscape. And so when I'm thinking about the ethics of how I go in and create an intervention, I'm very conscious of the fact that there's this intense history that informs my work and that I'm speaking to. And I really love photography that is pure in that there isn't intervention, just it captures the landscape. I'm really inspired by wilderness photographers and the way that they create connection to place through staying in a location and photographing it. But I guess photography is an intervention, to set up a tripod and to capture something with a photograph, that in itself is a kind of intervention. And so I'm taking it to the next level and making it very clear that I'm creating a juxtaposition by placing something into the landscape, and I hope to, through that juxtaposition, to get people thinking about the way that they view and respond and relate to landscape and environment in this country, beyond appreciating it as a beautiful image. And that's why symbolism like mirrors reflect that, gilding, which is the European kind of iconography, and that history that came with colonisation to this country of let's claim, let's fence, let's frame, let's turn it into a commodity, let's make it useful. And when I read all of the journals of the first explorers, they were writing about, it was all about whether this landscape could be made into a commodity to save the colony, because they were running out of farmland and they had to get across the mountains and explore the eastern interior to survive. So yeah, does that answer?
Yeah,
It's a tricky one, I think
I understand what you're saying, and landscape has its own ancient history and resonance. It doesn't always need an intervention. But in my work, I kind of get excited by the intervention, the theatrical nature of it. And I think when we're in the landscape and we're walking through it, we're an intervention.
Sure. I just that obviously landscape is not a neutral term. It's related to genre, it's related to art history, and even without physical intervention on the part of the photographer, say, or the artist, there's still things like composition and subject and so on, which are all culturally, very loaded in terms of their selection, but also in their history. But I was just wondering, Tamara, you're thinking about, I guess, just in the process of making work, there's obviously a very significant, if momentary, kind of intervention into the place with you and your crew and performers and so on.
Yeah. There is.
Yeah.
Look, I use the landscape as a device to make the point that we are a part of the landscape, and that involves bringing people into the landscape because, as humans, and in this sort of society that we're living in today, it's so divorced, and I feel like in my work, I'm trying to remind myself and people that we are actually a part of this world that we see ourselves as so separate in. So in my works, I sort of see the landscape as both a device to bring people together and to kind of try and become a part of visually, but also as a character that the people in the photographs have to negotiate with. Often people will get scratched, or there's a certain amount of discomfort the environment does impact on, or we impact on that environment, it impacts on the people. So I find it, when I think of ethics, I instantly go back to my roots in working in the media and the code of ethics that kind of photography as a photojournalist or documentary photographer kind of demands. And so it's a funny way for me in my mind to frame this, because it's sort of this code of ethics that I subscribed to almost so fervently, and then to actually start working the way that I have as represented on these walls, I had to completely turn my back on that approach, and I started seeing the landscape as a stage. And so I guess I'm drawing on all of those art histories of the landscape, but then kind of trying to tell my own story within it.
Well, you provide me with a perfect segue, because you were mentioning your career as a photojournalist.
Yeah.
One of the things that always strikes me about artists and is that they look at other artists' work. So I was wondering if you could both perhaps talk about some of the artist photographers who were influential in your thinking and development, and sort of how you kind of move through that influence into your own work, if you like.
Look, there's so many. I have to say, there are a lot of artists that have influenced me over time, but I have to say I'm mostly influenced by film and cinema and staging and theatre, and I couldn't name any particular. Well, I've got one that's sitting back here, but I can't retrieve it from the library. A massive influence, a filmmaker, but it will come. David Lynch.
Right.
I don't think my work looks like his films, but I love his nuance and the way that he creates narrative. And for photography, I could name a lot of different photographers, but I'll go back to the first, which was a Year 9 art class, and studying Tracy Moffat's iconic series, and I can't remember it.
Something more.
something more. Yeah, and having to, as a class, discuss that image and the tableau and, yeah, but cinema is a big influence.
Tamara?
Yeah, photography, it's a tricky one. A lot of my early influences were from a photojournalistic world, so Mary Ellen Mark and a number of photographers, mostly American, who were really representing humanity and the kind of an array of cultures and socioeconomic groups, and just like getting this fundamental sense of humanity. And I guess intimacy was something that I really looked for in my work. And so that was the foundation in the photography kind of way, Tracy Moffat's work as well. But painterly references are probably the stronger influences. So John William Waterhouse, Pre-Raphaelites, that would be where the sort of strongest aesthetic references come from for me.
Did you feel like there was at a point in the progress of your work as an artist, as distinct from the other photography you were doing, that you, I guess, had arrived at a point where you were free of your influences, that you were doing your own thing?
Yeah, and I feel really distinctly, I feel that in Our Nature series. For me, that really, I feel like it's a very hard thing to make original work, and I feel like I really achieved that in that series. And that's not something I say lightly. It's taken a long time to be able to say that, but I just really feel like bringing references together that are not literal, they're not obvious necessarily, but for me, they're resolved in an image that's mine.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Nicole? Was there a similar point for you? Did you feel as though you reached a point that you were... Well, let me explain what I mean by that a bit more. For me as a writer, I know for a lot of artists, they're influenced by people or inspired by people who are working in an area they want to work in themselves. A lot of that early work is very much an emulation, or trying to take what they like best of that thing. And as much as we like to think of our early work as being great and independent, or that, when we look back on it, I know certainly in my case I look at some of my early writing and see my influences very clearly, but I did realise there was a point somewhere down the track that I respected and acknowledged the influences that kind of left the work. I wasn't haunted by my aspiration to do what those artists and writers have done. So I mean, I know that's not...
No. In Australia, I think we're really fortunate. There's a lot of really strong female photographers who make work in landscape. Rosemary Lang being one of them. Huge, influence of mine, and I'm sure a lot of photographers. And so there's that history, and as I said, Tracy Moffat. I feel, to answer that question, I feel that the transformation film is, like you say, with your last year's series, wasn't it?
Yeah,
In
and
my
this
nature.
one. Yeah.
I feel that that's tapped into something that is uniquely mine, that comes from the first series of photographs I did in Hill End, where I was running through the landscape back in 2010 with a skeleton on my back, which was really about mortality and the life cycle and the history of the colonising women there, and children and men, of course. But for me, the women that lived in that harsh landscape, and so I was kind of connecting into that, and I've continued that series through, and the transformation film that's presented at the end is me walking through the landscape, and I feel in that work I've achieved that. And I've got some work now I'm excited about that's not here that I think is doing that as well. But yeah, it's a process. And I think to be comfortable when I'm making, I enjoy not looking at other people's art so much. I might watch movies and take in those sorts of influences, but there comes a point where I just have to do what I'm doing, and if I think too much about what's come before or what's happening around me in the contemporary art scene, it's, for me, it's not conducive to finding my own voice. And I think it takes time, doesn't it, to find your voice.
Well, that's a fantastic point. I guess I'll throw it open to questions in a second, but I just wanted to conclude them with one question following on from what you were just saying. Is that what would you say to people who wanted to explore the photography, being photographers themselves? Do they immerse themselves in their influences? Do they push all of that away and explore their own stuff? I mean, I know it's a broad and difficult question, but what's your advice for young people?
Just do it. Just do it. It's like anything. I mean, you can think of 1,000 reasons not to do, many different things. And the creative path of making work is challenging and it's confronting because you have to follow through and present, and then you have to deal with, people's responses but at the end of the day, creativity in its essence is a gift and a wonderful thing to do, and I just think do it whatever way you want to do it and be influenced as much as you choose to be by others, or lock yourself down, or whatever works to help that process happen. I think those mind viruses that you can get from looking too much at other people's work, or if you're getting them, maybe don't look at other people's work so much, but if you don't get that, then go for it. I think just find your rhythm.
Do you have advice for?
Look, I mean, I completely agree with everything Nicole said. I've personally just recently coming out of the series I've been doing underwater and saying, well, what next? Been getting myself in a real flap, and just actually the action of going out with some friends and their children very recently, and just going out and taking photographs. That just the act of that has now given me the momentum to move into a new series. And so just, getting out there and, or however you do work, but actually just starting, even if what you're doing isn't where you imagine it will end up, just starting that'll create its own momentum.
Brilliant advice, thank you. So let's open it up to questions. Has anyone got something they'd like to ask?
I was just interested, the winter photographs.
Yes,
Said they didn't make it.
they did make it. They're not on the walls in this show.
Just on the wall. Okay.
Yeah, no, I'm very, very fond of my winter shoot.
And where did you put the 80-year-olds?
So there was, I put them in foliage in what was called the Wild Western Garden, in a plant called Dusty Miller. And it was, the tones of it were quite silvery, and I actually had them move through the landscape in a whole lot of different ways. It was one of the most beautiful shoots I've ever done, as if you were sort of standing, I could stand outside myself and watch it. And eventually I chose the image where they were sort of folding down into the landscape, and their hair was sort of the same colour as the foliage. But there was, when you talk about the orphaned children of, when you mentioned the photographs you leave behind, there is a photograph that was within that shoot that I hold very dear to my heart, that has had no place out in the world, but I'd actually had my kids collect those helicopter seeds, and I took a bag of these helicopter seeds over with me for that shoot, because I wanted to have the seeds flying through the air while they were dancing in the landscape, these people, Elizabeth and George. And so I've got this incredibly light and, I don't know, just it's a very beautiful moment of George and Elizabeth dancing in their own little worlds together with these seeds falling and in all their glory. It was a beautiful moment.
And what season was that?
That was winter, but that's why I ended up...
I put the 80-year-olds in winter, I don't know why.
Yeah, but that's why I ended up choosing, with the editing process, I have to be very, very particular with why I choose the images, and the story that I was trying to tell was the image I chose where they were closer to the foliage and folding down was what fitted for me. Yeah.
Thanks.
Can I ask a frivolous question? Where did you photograph these?
These two were in Jervis Bay. So that's the most local shoot I've done. Yeah.
I've got a question for both of you. I love both of your works. They really resonate with me, and I see a sense of the sublime in your works, but not from a masculine viewpoint, more of a feminine viewpoint. And as you were saying earlier about that intervention into the landscape, for me it's a real sense of immersion. Even though you've got objects within that, there's something feminine about it as well, which I find really intriguing. Is that in your work at all? Do you see yourselves being a feminist voice at all? Feminine voice?
It's interesting because you work with figures. It would have to be somewhere in the way you represent them, and I think
Not consciously, but working with my own figure, I'm aware of how I'm representing myself as a woman nude in the landscape, and I want you never see my face because I don't want it to be identified as me. It's almost like acting, and it comes from if you were
influenced by the painters. What were you saying? The paintings that influenced you were
John William Waterhouse?
Well, for me, it's the romantic painters, romanticism, and often the figures in romantic paintings, you're seeing their back and not their face. And the idea is that the sublime is dwarfing the individual. And so for me, I'm conscious of that and bringing that into my work, the idea of the sublime and the awe-inspiring power of nature, which I think is really relevant now at a time when we're experiencing, bushfires and all of the climate change and the issues that Tamara is also talking about. Nature is wild, and it really is, at the end of the day, in control, even though we kind of like to imagine that we are. But in terms of the feminine, it's not conscious, but I'm aware of how I'm representing the female figure in the landscape, and these works, not so much, but perhaps it's there because I'm a woman. Not sure.
Did you want me to also
Yes.
answer? Yes. So I guess from the beginnings of my work, I was brought up in a family with very strong female. My mum is an incredible woman, so an amazing role model with sisters. Much of my early work was just all women, and I had to push myself to include men, to challenge myself. In fact, it was my son that inspired me to do that, because he was my first sort of introduction to to boys, really, and so there is definitely a feminine and feminist basis in my work. This particular shoot, it was a call out for all women. I wanted it to be just all women in this shoot, like a tornado, showing the power of women in being a voice for climate change, climate action. I think that as mothers, I just think there's a sense of care for the earth that women have that I wanted to give voice to.
Thank you.
We've got time for some more questions.
Thank you very much for your time today. I just wanted to get a sense of what was your biggest challenge that you feel you've overcome to get your pieces to this stage, because there's so many levels of complexity, and for young people today to see that it just doesn't appear, that social media aspect of everything's perfect. What were your struggles? What's maybe one thing that you overcame to get to this amazing place that you now exist in as an amazing photographer?
This week?
Awesome. Thank you.
I mean, it's constant.
Yeah, it would be.
I can't think of one monumental moment, but it's. I seem to have a habit of making things really complicated, and so I'm often overcoming failure in the work and trying to resolve. Recently, I shot a film in infrared, 4,800 photos time-lapse, but which is complex, in a storm, in infrared, which is really complex. And so that's this week's challenge that I've just overcome, so I'm able to come here and talk. Sweating. But yeah, it's constant for me.
So I can think of two very clear things. So I, by nature, am an introvert, relatively shy, despite sitting in front of everyone right now. When I joined the Sydney Morning Herald in my early days, I had to go from being a photographer who sort of just hid around the edges of things, trying to take pictures without people noticing, to having to walk into a situation and direct grown adults. And I didn't see myself as a grown adult at that point. So just that transition from being, I guess, from pushing through to sort of be able to at least appear as though I knew what I was doing when I was in those situations. And that was the biggest gift that I got from that entire, over a decade with the Herald, being able to take command in a situation. If things aren't going the right way, appearing for the sake of my models that they are. The other thing more recently, which is on a different level, was I'm actually quite scared of being in the ocean and not very confident, and so this entire series, my endangered series, was pushing myself into places that I was incredibly uncomfortable, terrified at times, absolutely terrified, and to achieve the work. So yeah, just having the idea of what I wanted to achieve and just going, okay, well, I've just got to suck it up and make this happen. So yeah.
Thank you.
That's okay.
One last question.
Do either of you have basically, now that you've put some bodies of work together, have a structure where you have almost like a timetable where you have to deliver the next series? And if you do, how does that impact on the pressure that would put on you, and do you think it impacts or may impact on the quality of work that you're then able to deliver?
I'm incredibly fortunate to have Martin as my gallerist, who is has been working in this area for a very long time and very understanding of the artist's process, and I've had no pressure on me whatsoever to be able to say, oh, I'm doing this next. So there are obviously the constraints of being a full-time artist and relying on that as an income that play into my my realistic ideas of how I'm going to make a living in the world. But in terms of coming up with it, all the pressure for that is from myself. Which is it's heavy.
Yeah, I think I would agree. It's I also am very supported by my gallerist, May Space, which is formerly Brenda May Gallery, and the scheduling of shows is flexible. It can get tricky if I'm doing it for coming up with new work for a group show that I've been curated into, and there is a definite exhibition date. But like Tamara, it's more the pressure that I put on myself and the expectations that I have around what it is that I'm doing and creating and what it needs to be, more so than any external pressure. And I'm really particular about not letting scheduled exhibitions interfere with the process and the work. So if I feel like I need to extend and push a solo show to a later date because the work, being experimental in nature, needs more time, then I will do that. I think for me it's really important to not be on a treadmill and not churning it out.
Okay, well, we're really going to have to end there. Please join me in thanking Tamara and Nicole.